And we're back, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Thursday evening here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. As many of you know, my single favorite historical figure ever is Muhammad Ali. Today, alas, is not a Muhammad Ali episode, but I will get to talk about my single favorite person to ever work in the movie business, and that would be none other than Clint Eastwood Jr. Clint Eastwood, Dirty Harry himself. Because on this day, 2009, a film of Clint's that took a lot of people by surprise. There were rumors as it was in pre-production, and Clint kind of teased that it was going to be a sixth Dirty Harry film, and even made a joke on Letterman. I think it was December of 2006. And he made a joke because they said, oh, he's shooting a film in Michigan or they're getting it ready. And it ended up not being a sixth Dirty Harry film. But released wide on this day in 2009 was Clint Eastwood's classic Gran Torino. And when I said that it took a lot of people by surprise, it was not a huge budget. And it was a bit of a leap of faith from Warner Brothers because Clint had made the two World War II films. It was originally supposed to be one, and then he more or less had to split it into two. He had Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima. Neither of those films, Clint did not appear in either of those films. And although Letters from Iwo Jima was one of the best reviewed films of, I believe, 2006, I think Flags of Our Fathers came out the previous year, didn't do well at the box office. And neither did Flags of Our Fathers. So there was probably some hesitancy on the part of the studio. You know, the thing with David Zaslav appearing to drag the executives who allowed Clint to make Cry Macho. 15 years prior, nobody was taking shots at Clint. He had his $25 to $30 million or whatever the exact budget was, including marketing. I'm not sure. It was listed at 25 to 30, but sometimes that includes marketing, sometimes it doesn't. But the surprise with Gran Torino is that it ended up being an enormous box office success. It grossed $270 plus million. And this is now 16 years ago, so maybe more like 400 if it had been released today. And this is a very specific sort of film. And this is not in any way a classic movie star performance from Clint. The last movie that you could say that Clint Eastwood, whether as director and star or just as star, for example, Within the Line of Fire in 93, the last conventional movie star type of role, leading man type of role, you have to go back to 1997's Absolute Power, which came out early in 97. So we're now talking about almost a dozen years later. And Clint in Absolute Power was in his mid-60s. I think he was playing his actual age. And he is a very forceful protagonist who's an anti-hero, actually. He's a jewel thief who ends up saving the day because the President of the United States is 100 times worse than any jewel thief, as played fucking brilliantly by the always fired Gene Hackman. Boy, Hackman, what an incredible actor. I wish he hadn't retired 20 years ago. You know, I wish he took the path of a Clint or even a Harrison Ford, who in his early 80s is still working a full schedule. But I digress. $1 Million Baby got all the acclaim. Clint's performance as the boxing trainer was extraordinary. There were people actually thinking maybe he could win Best Actor that year, but he ended up winning Director and Picture for a very, very difficult, exceedingly well made. But it is a movie that, despite Clint and Morgan, I will never, ever watch that movie again. Never. It's the best movie that I'll never watch again. I'm going to go down on that hill. That $1 Million Baby, no thank you, I'm all set here. Once was enough. You know, but in this film, with the success of $1 Million Baby being like 2 years before Clint got the go-ahead to make Gran Torino, I guess the studio figured, hopefully this works out. They liked the script, but you just don't know. Because there were people thinking that Letters from Iwo Jima was going to get more hardware for Clint, and even though the reviews were Rotten Tomatoes were well into the 90s, it ended up not really making that much of a splash, either with critics or audiences, or I should say, from the awards perspective. So Gran Torino is a story which appears to be an angry and pessimistic story. And the thing with Clint, you can play cantankerous, and there's almost a running gag that Tom Hanks in his older era this is his Clint Eastwood phase. Because Tom, in A Man Called Otto, it's almost literally the kind of character that Clint plays in Gran Torino, maybe a smidge nicer as the film opens. But the joke was, Tom, who worked with Clint so well, and what a great movie, Sully. I mean, the real story was terrific, but the film, Hanks, it's a fantastic performance by him. I mean, Clint got the max value from Tom Hanks for that role. And then A Man Called Otto, he's playing Clint in Gran Torino. He's doing the same kind of character. And Tom Hanks in News of the World, which was a little bit before A Man Called Otto in 2020, he's playing a Clint Eastwood type, strong, silent, get off my lawn kind of a guy. One of the most famous quotes of Clint's career comes in the movie Gran Torino. But for somebody who already was old and playing his real age, in the case of Clint, in Absolute Power, and in True Crime, which was not entirely successful, and in Blood Work, which was also really not that great, but $1 Million Baby was a fantastic film. But the Clint of Gran Torino is a guy who's in his late 70s. Walt Kowalski, a Korean War veteran, he is presented as a prejudiced, angry, he doesn't have the best relationship with really anyone in his family. His wife has passed as the movie opens. And there's an idea, because of whatever the public's perception of Clint Eastwood at that point in his career, what he must be like, what's his personal philosophy, what do we think his thought process is. And the film really takes us by surprise. And the reality of Clint Eastwood from a broad perspective is he is not somebody that you can put into a box in any way, shape, or form. Because just the fact that he's now 94, he's going to be 95, God willing, in May, the assumption is that he's an old fogey or that he has certain antiquated ideas. But going back to the 1960s, Clint Eastwood was way ahead of the curve. There's a picture of him from when his career first really started to get going with Rawhide, the TV series, where he's eating avocado toast. The fact that Clint Eastwood in the mid-1950s was eating avocado toast should give you an idea that he is not somebody that you can easily predict what he's going to do or the kinds of stories he is going to be interested in making. And the Clint Eastwood of, for example, The Outlaw Josey Wales is not the Clint Eastwood of Gran Torino. And the way I look at it is, speaking of Muhammad Ali, one of his greatest quotes, I believe, is applicable to Clint Eastwood's evolution as a filmmaker and in terms of the sorts of projects that he was interested in and why. And Ali's quote was, "A man who views the world the same at 50 as he did at 20 has wasted 30 years of his life." So Clint Eastwood, it's not just that he didn't want to keep going back to the same well because the audiences wouldn't come out for it. It's because he started to see the world differently as he aged. It's really not that wacky of an idea. But here, he being somebody at the top of Hollywood, we got to see in real time what are the sorts of projects that he is now interested in. And Gran Torino appears to be, I mean, it's a pretty simple story, but it appears to be a story of this cranky, angry, prejudiced old man who has a beautiful Gran Torino car, like that was real. And that was when people were talking about Dirty Harry 6, they saw this car, they said, well, maybe Harry's driving this car, and people just go nuts going down rabbit holes. And Clint making jokes on Letterman, his interview with Letterman, I think you can find it. I want to say it was December of 2006, where he makes a joke about, I'm working on Dirty Harry 6. What are you going to do? Maybe he would just be trying to fish at this point. He's not going to get involved in any murder cases. But the character Clint plays, Walt Kowalski, he is not presented as somebody that is unredeemable. And this is important to kind of ponder as we watch this film. He seems like he might be, but the events of the story cause him, it's not so much that he changes, but whatever horrors he saw in Korea, and we can imagine, if we have people in our lives, if we're fortunate enough to remember people who served in World War II, because it's unlikely that they're still around. They would be 100 or very close to it. But people who served in Korea, people who saw the horrors of Vietnam. There are people whose lives, the trauma, the accumulated trauma of what they saw out there, it did something to them. It doesn't mean that they are a horrible human being. They may be behaving in a horrible manner. And this is where you get the delineation and the kind of thing that Clint Eastwood doesn't look like the sort of person who would really give a shit about that, but he does. And this movie shows that he is interested in nuance. Walt Kowalski, as we meet him, is a blunt instrument. He is a guy who is going to give you his opinion, and it's probably going to be offensive, whether you like it or not. But if the story were just a cranky guy trying to get along with his neighbors, I mean, you could make a comedy out of it, as A Man Called Otto straddled the line between drama and comedy. Now, that film, the character that Tom Hanks plays, mild spoiler, he appears to be suicidal. Walt Kowalski is not suicidal, but he is also very dismissive of people who are not like him, and I don't just mean physically, but who don't think like him. And he knows, for example, I think he's a young pastor at the church that his wife went to, and his wife was very close to this young man and had told this kid, who looks like he's wet behind the ears, just got out of the seminary, please try to look after my husband. Go words to that effect. Oh, and we are led to believe they had a good marriage. They had a good marriage, so you can say, okay, he was not an abusive husband. Like, that's not this story. We know that there is some good in him. It's a question of, is there any way to get it out? And so in the early scenes where Clint meets with this young pastor, he doesn't want to hear from this guy. He doesn't really believe in God, and he doesn't want to be lectured about life from this kid. He's not interested. No, thank you. So Walt's neighbors, and this is an area in Michigan. Was it Lansing? I'm not sure if it was Lansing or where it was. I don't know where it was shot, where that it's supposed to be set, because obviously that's not the same thing. But he's in an area that has a very high Asian American contingent. And even though his issues were with people of Korean origin trying to kill him, he sees them all as the same. Like this is a guy who has carried around a lot of anger and hatred to a lot of different people. But in this case, these people in particular, he's not going to aggressively go after them. He is not that level, but he's somebody who doesn't want to associate with them. He just doesn't want to be bothered and doesn't want to associate with them. And then there's a little bit of a joke where they say the way to get into certain people, especially old people's good graces, if you think there might be a shred of humanity, that's not a quote in the movie, but if you think that there might be something worth actually getting to know, just offer food or offer beer or other kind of libations. You never know what you might end up uncovering. And in the world of this film, Walt Kowalski, in his own way, ends up in a kind of heroic mode where he is just an old man who is still a dangerous old man. He's packing, he's got a shotgun and presumably other weaponry. And this is not the Clint of the Mule, which was 8 or 9 years later. You get the feeling that this guy, despite his age, he could take somebody and stuff him into a garbage can. This is still a physically vital presence. This is not, and I give Clint credit for playing his character in The Mule as more or less a doddering old man. This Clint is old, in the immortal words of his buddy Arnold Schwarzenegger, he's old but not obsolete. And that's an important point to remember with the film, that Walt Kowalski might have more to offer almost every character in the story, depending on if they are antagonistic or they're kind of on his side. And it's some of Clint's best acting. As we know, he is not and was never the most gifted thespian as far as showing a lot of range. But within a certain range, he's a really good film actor. And that's something that Gene Siskel used to talk about, because Siskel and Ebert, but Siskel was a fan of Clint from the actor perspective. Of course, he appreciated his direction, except Unforgiven, which Roger thought was a masterpiece, and Gene just unbelievably gave thumbs down. But then again, Gene Siskel gave thumbs down to Silence of the Lambs the previous year, and Roger Ebert gave thumbs down to Blue Velvet 5 years before that, and Gene Siskel thought that was maybe the best film of its kind since Psycho. So you're always going to get this kind of discrepancy. But Gene Siskel believed that Clint, in the right role, was magic. It's not always a question of acting chops. It's a question of knowing how to hit your marks, understanding, speaking of Dirty Harry, man's got to know his limitations. There are certain kind of roles that audiences didn't really want to see Clint in. And then there are others where he took risks, such as the Any Which Way But Loose movies, and they paid it, and it paid off. It ended up, both of them were enormous box office hits. The risk here was that Clint's character was going to be so much of an asshole, so much of a bigot, that it was just going to turn audiences off to the point where they really don't care. And they don't want, it's not a matter of, can this guy be redeemed? We don't give a shit. We don't want to know from this guy. We wish this movie was not about him. And then you mentally check out. So it straddles a line where you see that his family, they're not deliberately cruel to him, but they feel like he's coming to the end, and there's a little bit of money involved, and where there is money, where there is a beautiful prized possession, such as a restored Gran Torino, people are going to show their craven natures. And this is where, without the film belaboring the point, there's a specific character of a granddaughter. And whether or not you want to be, or you're focused on being in someone's will in a certain way, how difficult can it be to treat your grandfather with respect? It has nothing to do with the fact that he's a Korean War veteran. And it has nothing to do with the fact that you hope that he leaves you his car. Can't you just be nice? Can you ask him a real question every now and then rather than just asking stuff that you think that he might want to hear? It's the fact that there's very little attempt from Walt's own family to really interact with him, as if he hasn't lost his marbles. He can still live on his own. And they're talking about maybe trying to put him in a home, or maybe not a home, but an assisted living, but he doesn't need it. They're looking at it from the perspective of, well, we don't know how much time he has left. You know what? Leave the fucking guy alone. You want to come over for dinner, you want to have a real conversation with your dad, with your grandpa, fine. But the way the family reacts, it's just not good. And you can understand why he's cranky all the time. And speaking of Tom Hanks, something that Tom does in the movie A Man Called Otto, I'm telling you, he did. He was mirroring Clint, and he was paying homage to Clint. Clint in this movie has this growl when he sees something he doesn't like, stupid kids, his ridiculous granddaughter with a belly button ring. Makes that kind of a noise. And Tom Hanks in A Man Called Otto does his version of that noise from Clint Eastwood. It is unmistakably Tom tipping his cap to somebody in the business he worked with and who he probably considers a friend and who he really got a kick out of. Because he said Clint doesn't say action. He doesn't say action. He just says, begin, or something on that, and he does a kind of good impersonation of Clint Eastwood. But most directors still yell action and they still yell cut. And Clint may yell cut, but he doesn't really give a shit about action. Just, okay, you can begin. And he's famous for not doing that many takes. And in this movie, there were a lot of real life people. The name of the HMONG, I think it's just called Hmong. And they are from, originally, historically, what would have been Mongolia, or what would be Mongolia. But many people consider them that, well, they're kind of like Chinese, but it's one particular area in China. But there are a lot of amateur performers here, and normally that would mean that you would do a ton of takes, but somehow Clint managed to get everyone in the cast because he famously does not do more than a couple of takes. He just doesn't do it. He's not interested in trying to find a perfect shot. And a lot of actors have talked about the fact that because you don't have more than a few takes, you got to have your A game right away. You can't fuck around. This is not Stanley Kubrick doing 300 of the same exact shot. You got to get it, and we're going to get the fuck out of here because there's people who have to eat, and so-and-so needs to go home. And Clint is very aware of everybody on the crew and what they're all up to. The film proper, I don't want to say it's not that important, but it's basically about Walt Kowalski getting involved in what turns into kind of a gang war and a turf war. And the way his character decides to handle it, and he becomes friends with a young man who unfortunately is, I believe, the cousin of one of the main gangbangers in this film. He originally is set up as an antagonistic character. He tries to steal Walt's car. But as Walt gets to know him, because some of the neighbors, they go out of their way to such an extent to show him kindness, Cliche though it may be, the hard heart of Walt Kowalski begins to melt. Because whatever humanity he had, whatever humanity that kid took with him to Korea, he lost some of it. But whatever it was that made his wife love him as much as she clearly did, there is something still there. There is something decent within him. And his ultimate outcome and the way that he decides to try to solve this awful problem is not what you think it's going to be. But it fits. It's fitting for the character and everything that we know of Walt Kowalski. And the last 15 minutes of this movie they're really beautiful. They're beautifully shot and edited and acted. And we're left with a mild spoiler, we're left with a pretty good feeling of Walt Kowalski that if he hasn't actually grown and changed, he has regained his humanity. Might be a better way to say it. That the Walt Kowalski at the end of the movie is probably the guy he could have been all along if he hadn't seen the horrible shit and done the horrible shit that he did in Korea all those years, which in the world of this movie would have been probably 50 plus years, not probably, would have been 50 plus years prior. Now, from the broader perspective, in the career of Clint Eastwood, top 5 greatest careers in the history of Hollywood, it's not even close. As producer, as director, as actor, the triple threat. He's even composed compositions from the music perspective. He's always been such a jazz enthusiast, and he's done some interesting little compositions for various films. But this is, I wouldn't call this a conventional leading man role. See, Clint was always a bit of an outlier, a unicorn, because he played so many leads, but he rarely played what you would call a conventional leading man. And by conventional leading man, I don't just mean the hero, I mean the hero, and the hero gets the girl. In his entire career, maybe he did it once, spoiler alert, In the Line of Fire, that's about it. Because Absolute Power, which is a similarly forceful, strong, leading man type role, the main relationship is trying to repair a relationship with his daughter, played really well by Laura Linney. Laura Linney, it's kind of one of those actresses, she could go both ways. She's very resourceful and talented, but I think she's fantastic with Clint in Absolute Power. They don't look anything alike, but the bond that they forge over the course of the story, it's well earned. But in this film, the bond that Walt Kowalski forms with Tao and with his family and everybody who he gets to know, this is not like any character that he played. There's nothing in his filmography to suggest that he would go in this direction and that the audiences would follow him. And this was a film that it got good reviews. It's in the 80%, like in the 80s, 83 or something like that at Rotten Tomatoes, which would indicate, very, very favorable reviews. But this was a film that had fantastic word of mouth. And it was kind of always made me laugh. There was a guy I used to work out with at Bev's gym. He saw the film, I think, 3 times in theaters, and it immediately became one of his favorite movies. He liked the fact that Walt was so crusty and cantankerous, to have some laughs, and the joke was, I said, and this guy was in his 30s at the time, I said, do you see yourself as being like Walt Kowalski when you get to be that age? And with a straight face, he says, no, I see myself that way right now. And we were roaring with laughter because he was exaggerating. But he liked the fact that the movie was not just this guy is a cranky, cantankerous, inappropriate, prejudiced old man. He's somebody that actually achieves something or tries to achieve something other than that in what could be, the last couple of years of his life. Because you don't know when you get into your late 70s and you've lived that kind of hard scrabble existence that Walt Kowalski has lived. You just don't know. And Clint's performance, there were some people who thought he might draw another Oscar nomination for acting, because he was nominated for lead actor for Unforgiven, but that was the year. It was either going to be Denzel for Malcolm X, probably should have won, or Al Pacino for Scent of a Woman, who did win. Al Pacino was owed a Best Actor Oscar. How many times he was phenomenal and didn't win? They had to throw him a bone. It wouldn't have been right if Al Pacino had never won an Oscar. It just not okay. But Clint in this movie is as good as he's ever been, because with just doesn't have a ton of dialogue, and he has a scowl on for most of the movie, not surprisingly, because Walt is a very easy to agitate individual. But it is really beautiful work from him. And he clearly wanted to allow the younger actors to shine. And this is a thing with Clint. Whatever vanity he might have, he doesn't show any of it. He usually doesn't show it in his films, but especially in this one, the way that his character doesn't do what you think he's going to do. And this is something where you would draw distinctions, for example, between Clint, between Stallone, and between Arnold. Now, I don't know why Arnold and Sly ended up so tight and why Arnold and Clint were always attached at the hip, but Clint Eastwood and Sylvester Stallone are just friends. But they never, the only time they came close to working together was Expendables, where Sly said, I actually called Clint first, but he was too busy. And my sense was he would have wanted to direct it and have more control of it than I would have been comfortable with. So we ended up not going that route. But the thing where I was going with that is that Clint is at heart a 70s star. He is at heart a 70s star. And what that means is the hero might triumph at the end. He might not. He might die at the end. He might not. He might survive the events of the story, but he might not altogether emerge victorious. And Dirty Harry, the more you watch the movie, not really a spoiler. If you're this far in this episode, you've seen it. You can win at the surface level, but the movie gives you enough to chew on where you say, did this guy really win at all? And one thing that Stallone has talked about, and he's not even joking, he does not like to play characters who either lose at the end or die. He does not, that is not his thing. And Clint doesn't really give a shit. Whatever's going to work best for the story, whatever ideas he has, the writer and whoever else is involved in the collaborative process of making a movie, what are we going to do? And in this film, it is as little vanity as possible, where his character, as much as he kind of warms up, he doesn't suddenly become fuzzy and sweet and gentle. He's still the same guy, but he's now being directed in a different area and going into a different arena. And the way the film wraps up, it seems logical, but the first time through, there's no way that anybody is going to say, oh yeah, this is for sure how it's going to wrap up. And there was no sense of, Clint standing tall one final time, gunfighter going out in a blaze of glory, or not even, or in the case of Unforgiven, where nobody could shoot straight because everybody is shitting bricks except him. And the only other character that probably could take him on, well, he had shot him first. Oops, tough shit, This isn't right. I was building a house. Unbelievable line of dialogue for Gene Hackman in Unforgiven. I was building a house. What? So what? What does that mean, you were building a house? This isn't right. Dying like this, I was building a house. I'll see you in hell. Yeah. Boom. I actually didn't see Gran Torino in theaters, sorry to say. I haven't seen as many Clint Eastwood movies in theaters as you would probably have expected. I saw Unforgiven in theaters. That was the first one that I saw in the movies. I saw In the Line of Fire. I saw A Perfect World. I saw Bridges of Madison County. I saw Absolute Power. Those are the Clint Eastwood movies that I saw in theaters. I didn't see True Crime in theaters. Oh, I'm sorry, Space Cowboys, which I absolutely love. What a great movie. One of the most entertaining films that Clint ever made. Top 5 most just pure entertainment value. That film is an absolute home run. But Gran Torino is a great film. And there were a lot of people who were surprised that it didn't get any Oscar nominations because there were critics that had it on their 10 best list. And many critics said, this is up there with Clint's best work. Here he is in his 70s, still knocking it out of the park. Way to go. Because by that point, Clint's comeback with Unforgiven was already more than 15 years in the past. He had just churned out one terrific film after another with very few failures. I mean, True Crime is just okay. Blood Work, But he was still turning out really high quality work. And there are those that they have Gran Torino in Clint's certainly top 5. I think I would have it in his top 10. I don't think that there's any room in the top 5. But it is a really, really good movie. And a kind of film that may not sound interesting to you, but if you give it a chance, I don't know anybody who has seen it who doesn't at least say, yeah, it was good. nobody has said, oh, what a piece of shit that was. Where there were people who had a terrible reaction to Million Dollar Baby and were just so turned off by what happens in the second half of the story that they wouldn't even recommend it. Everyone I know who has seen Gran Torino recommends it. And God bless Clint Eastwood. Again, 94 years old. I have yet to see Juror Number 2. I know that it's been streaming on Max. I just haven't had a chance to say, because I want to watch the film in one shot. But Clint Eastwood at 94 now, and I don't know if there was a talk that he was looking at scripts, but I don't think he's making any more movies. I just hope if he could make it to 100 and still be as vital and sharp as he is now, because I saw some behind the scenes footage of him directing, and Toni Collette even talked about this on her social media, how agile he is moving around the set. The fact that he's still giving direction like it's the movie Breezy in 1973 with Kay Lenz and William Holden, where you see Clint in pictures getting down with the actors, moving down to make sure that the marks are correct. She said that he's still that kind of filmmaker. He was 93 and 94 when he made that movie. It is absolutely extraordinary. Gran Torino, opening wide in the United States on this day, 2009, and ended up grossing more than $270 million. This has been episode 403 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Thursday evening here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Until then, peace.